The morning sun streamed through the stained glass windows of St. Patrick's Cathedral, casting rainbow patterns across Elena Martinez's white wedding dress. She had imagined this day countless times since Alexander Chen had proposed under the cherry blossoms in Central Park, but never like this. Never standing alone in the bride's room, staring at her phone, waiting for answers that wouldn't come. "He's probably just stuck in traffic," her sister Rosa kept saying, pacing back and forth in her lavender bridesmaid dress. But Elena knew better. The knot in her stomach told a different story. 3 hours before, everything had been perfect. Elena had woken up to hundreds of white roses filling her hotel suite, Alexander's traditional surprise whenever he had to travel for work. Her mother and aunts had helped her into her dress, crying happy tears as they pinned her grandmother's mantilla veil into her dark curls. Even the weather had cooperated, providing a gorgeous spring morning after a week of rain. The first sign that something was wrong came when Alexander's best man couldn't reach him. Then his phone started going straight to voicemail. By the time Elena's father found the note in the groom's room, 200 guests were already seated in the cathedral's main hall. The string quartet was halfway through their pre-ceremony playlist, and Elena's mascara was somehow still perfect, though that wouldn't last much longer. "I can't do this. I'm sorry." 5 words written in Alexander's hurried handwriting on the hotel's notepad. 5 words to end 5 years of love, laughter, and shared dreams. The murmurs from the gathering crowd grew louder as time ticked by. Elena could hear the worried whispers through the heavy wooden door. Her mother wanted to send everyone home, but Elena refused. She needed to face this moment, to walk into that cathedral herself and tell their friends and family that there would be no wedding today. The weight of her diamond engagement ring felt suddenly heavy on her finger as she pushed open the door. The faces that turned to look at her were filled with pity, confusion, and shock. These were the same people who had watched her and Alexander fall in love during college, who had celebrated their graduations, who had cheered when they announced their engagement. "The wedding is cancelled," Elena announced, her voice stronger than she felt. "Alexander isn't coming." The silence that followed was deafening. Her father stepped forward to hold her, but Elena took a step back. She couldn't accept comfort, not yet. If she did, she would break down completely. Instead, she looked at the gathered crowd, memorizing the moment in all its painful detail, the half-filled champagne glasses, the flower girls still clutching their baskets of rose petals, the orchestra frozen mid-note. What Elena didn't know then, what she couldn't have known, was that the mild nausea she'd been attributing to wedding nerves was actually morning sickness. In her purse, a pregnancy test sat unopened, waiting for what was supposed to be a romantic surprise on their honeymoon. Life, it seemed, had other plans. As guests began to file out, offering awkward condolences or avoiding eye contact entirely, Elena stood rooted to the spot. Her sister gathered her things from the bride's room. Her mother spoke quietly with the wedding coordinator about cancellations, and her father made calls to distant relatives who were still en route to the ceremony. The cathedral emptied slowly, like a theater after a tragedy. Elena walked down the aisle alone, her wedding dress whispering against the marble floor. She paused at the altar, looking up at the soaring ceiling and magnificent architecture. This was where she had imagined making her vows, promising forever to the man she loved. Instead, she was making a different kind of promise to herself. Later that night, in her childhood bedroom, where she'd fled to escape the pitying looks and endless questions, Elena finally allowed herself to cry. She cried for the future she'd lost, for the humiliation of being abandoned, for the love she thought was unshakable. But mostly, she cried because deep down, she knew this wasn't really the end of her story, it was just the beginning of a very different one. As she drifted off to sleep, exhausted from the emotional toll of the day, Elena had no way of knowing that in just a few weeks, she would discover news that would change her life forever. She couldn't have guessed that Alexander's disappearing act had left behind more than just a broken heart and cancelled wedding plans. The universe, it seemed, had a surprising way of rewriting endings into beginnings. Elena stared at the 4 positive pregnancy tests lined up on her bathroom counter, each one confirming what she had begun to suspect. 6 weeks had passed since the wedding that wasn't, and now life was throwing her another curveball. Her hands trembled as she called her doctor's office to schedule an appointment. The morning sickness had become impossible to ignore, though she tried blaming it on stress and heartbreak. When she finally visited her doctor, the ultrasound revealed something that made her grab the edge of the examination table in shock. 4 heartbeats, the doctor said gently, pointing at the screen. Congratulations, Ms. Martinez, you're carrying quadruplets. Elena couldn't speak. 4 babies. 4 tiny lives growing inside her, each one a piece of the future she thought she'd lost. The room spun slightly, and she was grateful for the paper tissue beneath her fingers to grip onto. That evening, she sat at her kitchen table in her small New York apartment, surrounded by takeout containers she couldn't bring herself to eat. Her phone buzzed with another message from Rosa, checking in as she had every day since the wedding. Elena had told no one about the pregnancy yet, not even her sister. How could she explain this to her family? To her friends? To the world? The decision to leave New York came during a sleepless night as she watched the city lights flicker outside her window. She couldn't raise 4 babies alone in a tiny Manhattan apartment on her illustrator's salary. More importantly, she couldn't bear the whispers and stares that would follow when her pregnancy became public knowledge. Her hometown of Tucson, with its warm desert air and tight-knit community, called to her. Her parents still lived in the adobe house where she'd grown up, with its sprawling backyard and room to breathe. They welcomed her back without questioning her sudden desire to come home, attributing it to her broken heart. The morning she told her family about the pregnancy, her mother dropped a bowl of pancake batter on the kitchen floor. Her father sat down heavily in his favorite armchair. Rosa burst into tears. Happy ones, she insisted. But when Elena revealed she was carrying 4 babies, the room erupted into chaos. Dios mío, her mother whispered, crossing herself before pulling Elena into a fierce hug. My baby is having babies. The months that followed tested Elena's strength in ways she never imagined. Her body changed dramatically, carrying 4 new lives. Her mother and aunts rallied around her, drawing on generations of family wisdom. Her father quietly converted his home office into a nursery, painting the walls a soft yellow. Rosa took charge of organizing baby showers and doctor's appointments. Elena continued her illustration work from home, determined to build a stable future for her children. Her editor, amazed by her dedication, connected her with a children's book publisher. Between doctor's visits and bouts of morning sickness, she created a series of whimsical drawings that would later become her first published book. The pregnancy was challenging, but Elena found unexpected joy in preparing for her babies. Each ultrasound revealed more of their personalities, one particularly active, another shy and tucked away, 2 always close together. She talked to them constantly, telling them stories about their family, about her hopes for their future, carefully avoiding stories about their father. At 7 months, when her doctor ordered bed rest, Elena spent her days sketching her growing family. She drew tiny hands and feet, imagined their faces, and planned for their future. Her mother moved into the guest room, keeping her company and sharing stories of her own pregnancy with Elena and Rosa. The babies arrived on a warm October morning, 6 weeks early but fighting strong. 3 girls and a boy, each perfect and tiny. As Elena held them for the first time, exhausted but overwhelmed with love, she saw both herself and Alexander in their features. Maya, the eldest by 2 minutes, had her father's determined chin. Sophia shared Elena's curls. Isabella had Alexander's eyes. And little Lucas, the youngest, had his father's contemplative expression. In those first weeks, Elena barely slept. 4 babies meant round-the-clock feedings, diaper changes, and attention. Her family created a rotation schedule, ensuring she was never alone. Her father would walk the halls at night with fussy babies, singing old Mexican lullabies. Her mother seemed to always know which baby needed what. Rosa became an expert at simultaneously feeding 2 babies at once. As the months passed, Elena built a new life centered around her children. She converted part of the house into a home studio, working on her illustrations while the babies napped. Her children's books began gaining attention, featuring stories of family, love, and adventure inspired by her own little ones. What started as her biggest challenge became her greatest blessing. The quadruplets filled her days with chaos and her heart with more love than she thought possible. Yes, there were moments when she wondered if Alexander would want to know about his children, but those thoughts grew fewer as time passed. She had chosen to face this journey alone, and watching her babies grow, she knew she'd made the right decision. The view from the 96th floor of the Quantum Leap Solutions headquarters was breathtaking, but Alexander Chen barely noticed it anymore. 5 years had passed since that morning at St. Patrick's Cathedral, and he built his empire on sleepless nights and relentless work. The business magazines called him brilliant, innovative, visionary. None of them knew he was running from his own ghost. His assistant knocked gently on his office door, carrying the latest issue of Forbes magazine. Alexander was on the cover again, looking polished in his tailored suit, though his eyes held a distance that photographers could never quite edit away. The Quantum King, the headline declared, how Alexander Chen revolutionized computing. He tossed the magazine aside without reading it. These days, he barely recognized the man in those photos, the one who smiled for cameras and gave carefully scripted speeches at tech conferences. The real Alexander spent his nights in his private lab, losing himself in quantum algorithms and circuit designs because numbers made sense in a way that people never had. "Sir," his assistant spoke up, "the board is waiting in the main conference room for your presentation." Alexander nodded, gathering his papers. Another day, another meeting. His latest breakthrough in quantum computing had doubled the company's stock price overnight. At 32, he was worth billions, but wealth had become just another number to track, like lines of code or processing speeds. During his presentation, he moved through the slides with practiced ease, explaining how their new quantum processor could revolutionize medical research. The board members nodded enthusiastically, already calculating their profits. None of them noticed how their CEO's hands shook slightly when he mentioned the processor's applications in genetic research. Later that evening in his penthouse apartment, Alexander stood at his floor-to-ceiling windows, watching the city lights flicker below. The space was minimalist, almost sterile, no photos, no personal touches, just expensive furniture he'd never chosen and art he'd never really looked at. His phone buzzed with messages from his mother in Singapore, probably another gentle reminder about settling down, finding someone new. He poured himself a glass of water, avoiding the bar cart. He'd learned early on that alcohol didn't quiet the memories, it only made them louder. Memories of Elena's laugh during their college study sessions, of planning their future over late-night diner coffee, of the moment he realized he couldn't go through with the wedding. The panic attack that morning had been the worst of his life. He'd stood in the groom's room, bow tie half done, when the weight of forever came crashing down. His father's voice echoed in his head, "Chen men are meant for greater things than family life." The same words he'd heard at 10 when his father walked out on them, choosing his research over his wife and son. Alexander had convinced himself he was protecting Elena. Better to break her heart once than slowly, piece by piece, like his father had done to his mother. So he ran, throwing himself into his work, building Quantum Leap from a promising startup into a tech giant. His latest project sat open on his laptop, a quantum computing application that could process vast amounts of genetic data, potentially predicting inherited conditions generations in advance. The irony wasn't lost on him. Here he was, developing technology to understand family connections, while he'd thrown away his own chance of family. Sometimes, late at night like this, he would open his private browser and type Elena's name. He never pressed enter. Some doors were better left closed. Instead, he'd return to his work, pushing the boundaries of what computers could do, trying to solve problems that couldn't fix what he'd broken. The next morning brought news of another acquisition opportunity. A small educational technology company in Phoenix showing promising innovations in children's learning apps. Alexander skimmed the report, noting the company's impressive growth and unique approach to interactive education. "We should send someone to check it out," his CFO suggested during their morning meeting. "I'll go," Alexander said, surprising everyone including himself. He hadn't personally handled an acquisition in years, but something about this one caught his attention. Maybe it was the company's focus on education, or maybe he just needed a change of scenery. His team scrambled to arrange the details, unused to their CEO taking such a hands-on approach. As his private jet took off for Phoenix the following week, Alexander reviewed the company's portfolio on his tablet. Their apps helped children learn through storytelling and interactive illustrations, combining technology with creativity in a way that felt oddly familiar. What Alexander couldn't know, was that this business trip would shatter the carefully constructed walls he'd built around his past. In less than 24 hours, he would come face to face with not just his greatest regret, but with a truth that would redefine everything he thought he knew about himself and his choices. As the plane descended into Phoenix, the desert sunset painted the sky in shades of orange and purple. Alexander straightened his tie, prepared for another routine acquisition meeting. The universe, however, had other plans that had been in motion since that morning. He left his bride to be standing alone at the altar. Elena checked her presentation one last time before the meeting with Quantum Leap Solutions. Her educational app company had grown beyond her wildest dreams, combining her illustrations with interactive learning technology. She'd worked late into the night perfecting every detail, unaware that her past was about to walk through the door. The morning sun streamed through the windows of her company's modest conference room in Phoenix. Her team buzzed with excitement about meeting representatives from the tech giant. Elena had opted to keep her illustrator's studio at home, closer to the kids, but she maintained a small office here for important meetings. "They're here," her assistant whispered, poking her head through the door. Elena nodded, smoothing her navy blue dress and taking a deep breath. She'd faced tougher meetings than this. Still, something felt different today, a strange flutter in her stomach that she couldn't explain. The conference room door opened, and Elena's world stopped spinning. There, in an impeccable charcoal suit, stood Alexander Chen. 5 years had added subtle lines around his eyes and threads of silver at his temples, but he was unmistakably the man who had left her at the altar. He looked equally shocked, his normally composed face draining of color. Time seemed to freeze as their eyes met. Elena's presentation clicker slipped from her suddenly numb fingers, clattering on the conference table. The small sound broke the spell, and reality came rushing back in all its complicated glory. "Elena," Alexander breathed, her name fallen from his lips like a forgotten prayer. Before either of them could say more, chaos erupted from the hallway. The door burst open again as 4 small tornadoes of energy rushed in, followed by an apologetic-looking Rosa. "Mama," Maya called out, leading the charge. "Gia Rosa said we could show you our science project." The other 3 children clustered around Elena, each talking over the others in their excitement. Elena watched as Alexander's eyes moved from one child to another, recognition dawning on his face. She saw him note Maya's determined chin, his chin. Sophia's curls might have come from Elena, but her analytical gaze was all Alexander. Isabella's eyes were a perfect match for his and little Lucas. Lucas was almost a miniature version of Alexander himself. "I'm so sorry," Rosa said, trying to herd the children back out. They were supposed to wait in the break room. But Alexander wasn't looking at Rosa. He wasn't even breathing. His eyes were locked on the children, his children, as the mathematical impossibility of their existence crashed against the undeniable evidence before him. "4," he whispered, gripping the back of a chair for support. The quadruplets, sensing the strange tension in the room, fell quiet. Maya, always the protective one, moved closer to Elena. Sophia tilted her head, studying Alexander with curious eyes. Isabella half hid behind her sister, while Lucas stood his ground, clutching his beloved tablet. "Everyone," Elena said, her voice remarkably steady, "why don't you go with Tia Rosa? Mama needs to have an important meeting." "But our science project," Maya protested. "Later, me and more," Elena promised, touching her daughter's cheek gently. "Rosa, please." As Rosa ushered the children out, Elena could see Alexander tracking their movements, his eyes wide with disbelief. The other executives in the room shifted uncomfortably, clearly sensing they were witnessing something far beyond a standard business meeting. Once the door closed behind the children, silence fell heavy in the room. Elena's team members exchanged worried glances. Alexander's executives looked between their CEO and the woman who was supposed to be presenting, trying to piece together what was happening. Perhaps, Alexander's CFO suggested carefully, "We should reschedule." "Yes," Elena found her voice. "I think that would be best." She gathered her materials with trembling hands, hyper-aware of Alexander's gaze still fixed on her. As the room cleared out, leaving them alone, the weight of 5 years of unspoken words hung between them. Elena could see the questions forming on Alexander's lips, could practically hear the calculations running behind his eyes as he processed what he just discovered. "They're 5, he said finally, his voice rough. It wasn't a question. "Yes," Elena replied simply. "4 of them." "Yes." Alexander sank into a chair, his usual poise deserting him. "Why didn't you?" he started, then stopped, seeming to realize the absurdity of asking why she hadn't told him after he disappeared on their wedding day. "You left," Elena said, each word carefully controlled. "You left a note and vanished. What was I supposed to do? Chase after you? I didn't even know about them until 2 weeks later." The sunlight continued to pour through the windows, indifferent to the drama unfolding below. Outside, life in Phoenix went on as usual, while inside this conference room, 2 people faced a moment that would change everything again. "I need." Alexander stood abruptly, then swayed slightly. "I need time to process this." "Funny," Elena said, a hint of steel entering her voice. "That's exactly what I didn't have when you left me at the altar. But don't worry, I managed just fine on my own. We all did." She gathered her things, heading for the door. At the threshold, she paused, looking back at the father of her children, a man who was both intimately familiar and completely foreign to her now. "We'll be here when you're ready to talk," she said softly. "Just don't run away again." They deserve better than that. The desert sunset painted the sky in brilliant oranges and purples as Elena sat in her backyard, watching her children play. 2 days had passed since the shocking reunion at her office, and she knew Alexander would come. He was many things, but a coward wasn't one of them, at least not anymore. When her phone buzzed with an unknown number, she wasn't surprised to see his message asking to meet. She chose a quiet coffee shop, away from both their offices and her home. Some conversations needed neutral ground. The cafe was nearly empty when Alexander arrived, looking less polished than his usual business self in jeans and a simple blue button-down shirt. Elena noticed how he scanned the room, an old habit from their college days when he was always looking for the quietest spot to study. "Thank you for meeting me," he said, sliding into the chair across from her. His coffee sat untouched, a barrier between them. "I figured we had a lot to talk about," Elena replied, wrapping her hands around her own cup. "Where would you like to start?" Alexander ran a hand through his hair, a gesture so familiar it made Elena's heart ache. "They're beautiful," he said finally. "The children, they're absolutely beautiful." "They are," Elena agreed. "Maya's the leader. She always makes sure everyone's okay. Sophia spends hours drawing, just like I used to. Isabella's our adventurer. She climbs everything in sight. And Lucas," she paused, seeing Alexander lean forward slightly. "Lucas is so much like you. He's always taking things apart to see how they work." "Tell me everything," Alexander whispered. "Please, I need to know what I missed." So Elena told him about discovering she was pregnant 2 weeks after he left, about the shock of learning it was quadruplets, about the decision to move home to Tucson. She told him about the difficult pregnancy, the early delivery, the endless nights of feeding and changing 4 babies. "Why didn't you try to find me?" Alexander asked, his voice rough with emotion. Elena's laugh held no humor. "With what time? Between caring for 4 newborns, building my career, and trying to keep my sanity. Besides," she added softly, "you made your choice pretty clear that morning." Alexander flinched. "I was scared," he admitted. "Terrified, actually. That morning, looking in the mirror, all I could see was my father. All I could think about was how he left us, how he chose his work over his family. I convinced myself I would do the same to you. So instead, you left before you had the chance to fail." Elena's voice was gentle, but her words hit home. "I thought I was protecting you," he said, staring into his cold coffee. "I threw myself into work, built Quantum Leap into what it is today. I told myself it was better this way, if I'd known." "If you'd known about the babies, would it have changed anything?" Elena asked. "Would you have been ready then?" The question hung between them, heavy with possibility. Alexander's silence was answer enough. "That's what I thought," Elena said. "Look, Alexander, I didn't invite you here to make you feel guilty. What's done is done. But those 4 amazing children, they're here now. They're real, and they deserve to know their father, if he's ready to be in their lives consistently." Alexander leaned back, running both hands over his face. "Tell me about them. Really tell me. What are they like?" Elena pulled out her phone, scrolling through photos. Maya was born first. She's our problem solver. Last week, she organized a cleanup crew at school all by herself. Sophia's our artist. She sees beauty in everything. She turned our garage wall into a mural with washable paint. Isabella never stops moving. She's taking gymnastics now. And Lucas, she smiled, showing Alexander a photo of their son surrounded by disassembled electronics. He's already building his own games on that tablet he carries everywhere. They're 5, Alexander said, more to himself than to Elena. 5 years old, and I've missed everything. Not everything, Elena corrected him. They're still young. There's so much ahead. First day of kindergarten, lost teeth, science fairs, birthday parties. But she leaned forward, making sure she had his full attention. If you want to be part of their lives, it has to be all in. No disappearing when things get tough. No choosing work over family. They deserve better than that. Alexander nodded slowly. I want to meet them. Properly, I mean. Not just that chaos in the conference room. I want to know them. We'll need to take it slow, Elena cautioned. They're smart kids. They'll have questions. We need to be prepared for that. Do they? Alexander hesitated. Do they know about me at all? Elena sighed. They know their father lives far away and works with computers. They know he's not ready to be part of their lives yet. I never wanted them to feel abandoned, so I always said you weren't ready, not that you didn't want them. Tears welled in Alexander's eyes, the first Elena had ever seen from him. Thank you, he whispered, for protecting them, for being strong enough for both of us. As the sun set outside the cafe window, 2 people who had once planned to spend their lives together began planning something different, a way forward that put 4 small children at the center of everything. It wasn't the future they'd imagined years ago at the altar, but maybe, just maybe, it could be something equally meaningful. The small house Alexander rented in Phoenix felt nothing like his luxurious Manhattan penthouse, but as he arranged the kids' space, it felt more like home than anywhere he'd lived in years. He'd spent hours choosing everything, from the colorful bean bags to the art supplies to the mini workbench for Lucas. Elena had suggested he start with weekend visits, giving the children time to adjust to his presence in their lives. Their first meeting was at a local park, neutral territory where the kids could feel comfortable. Alexander arrived early, pacing nervously near the playground. When Elena's minivan pulled up, his heart nearly stopped. 4 small figures tumbled out, full of energy and curiosity. Children, Elena said gently, gathering them close, remember what we talked about. This is your father, Alexander. He's come a long way to meet you. Maya stepped forward first, brave as always. Do you really make computers? She asked, tilting her head in a way that reminded Alexander so much of himself. I do, he replied, kneeling to meet her eye level. Would you like to learn about them? Sophia hung back, clutching her sketchbook. Isabella bounced on her toes, unable to contain her energy. Lucas stared at Alexander with intense concentration, his tablet clutched to his chest like a shield. That first afternoon was awkward but precious. Alexander pushed swings, watched Isabella demonstrate cartwheels, and listened to Sophia explain her latest art project. Lucas eventually settled beside him on a bench, shyly showing him a game he'd been trying to create. You're doing great, Elena whispered as they watched the kids play. Just be patient. They'll come around in their own time. The weeks that followed fell into a gentle rhythm. Alexander moved most of his work to Phoenix, leaving his CFO to handle the New York office. Every Saturday morning, he'd pick up the kids for their special Dad Day. They'd explore science museums, visit parks, or spend hours in the creative space he'd set up in his rental house. Maya proved to be his toughest critic, watching him carefully for any sign he might disappear again. Why did you leave before? She asked one day while they were building a robot kit together. Alexander's hands stilled on the circuit board. I was scared, he admitted, choosing honesty. Sometimes grown-ups make mistakes when they're scared. But I'm trying to be braver now. Sophia warmed to him through art. She'd bring her sketchbook to every visit, drawing their activities together. One picture showed all 6 of them, Elena, Alexander, and the Quadruplets, holding hands. Alexander kept it framed on his desk. Isabella challenged him physically, insisting he learn to cartwheel, you're doing it wrong, Dad, and climb the monkey bars. He discovered muscles he forgot he had, but her delighted laughter made every ache worthwhile. Lucas was the surprise. Quiet but observant, he shared Alexander's fascination with technology. They spent hours taking apart old computers, Lucas soaking up knowledge like a sponge. "You're just like me at your age," Alexander told him one day, and Lucas's smile lit up the room. The hardest moments came when he had to leave for business trips. "Promise you'll come back," Maya would demand, her small face serious. Alexander learned to schedule video calls during his travels, reading bedtime stories through the screen and never, ever missing a promised call. Elena watched this transformation with cautious optimism. She saw how Alexander rearranged board meetings around school events, how he learned each child's favorite foods and fears, how he showed up consistently, day after day. "They're changing you," she observed one evening as they discussed the kids' upcoming school play. "They're healing me," he corrected, looking years younger than the stressed CEO she'd met in that conference room months ago. "I spent so long running from the fear of becoming my father that I almost missed the chance to be something better, their father." The breakthrough came unexpectedly during a regular Sunday dinner at Elena's house. Alexander had been invited to these family meals, slowly becoming part of their routine. He was helping Maya with her math homework when Sophia ran in, excited about a drawing she'd made. "Look, Daddy," she called out, and the room froze. It was the first time any of them had called him that. Sophia didn't even seem to notice, launching into an explanation of her artwork, but Alexander had to blink back tears. Later that night, as he was leaving, all 4 children hugged him goodbye, another first. "See you tomorrow, Daddy," they chorused, then raced off to get ready for bed. Alexander stood in the doorway, overwhelmed. "They trust you now," Elena said softly. "Don't prove them wrong." "Never again," he promised, and for the first time in their complicated history, they both knew he meant it. That night, in his rented house that was slowly becoming a home, Alexander looked at the family photos now covering his walls, moments captured over the past months. There was Maya's science fair project, Sophia's dance recital, Isabella's gymnastics meet, and Lucas's first coding competition. He hadn't missed a single one. His phone buzzed with a message from Elena, a photo of all 4 kids asleep, surrounded by the stuffed animals he'd given them. The caption read, "They asked for their daddy's goodnight kiss. Don't forget tomorrow." Alexander touched the screen gently, marveling at how 4 small people had completely reorganized his priorities, his heart, and his entire world. The fear of becoming his father had been replaced by something stronger, the determination to be the father his children deserved. The elementary school auditorium buzzed with excitement as parents filed in, clutching programs and phones ready to record. Tonight was the spring musical, and all 4 of the Chen Martin's children had parts to play. Alexander sat next to Elena, both of them trying not to laugh as they spotted Lucas peeking through the curtain for the 5th time. "He gets that from you," Elena whispered. "Remember how you used to check the audience before every presentation?" Alexander smiled, remembering their college days. A year had passed since that life-changing meeting in his Phoenix office. In that time, he'd learned more about love, family, and courage than in all his previous years combined. The lights dimmed and the show began. Maya, ever the leader, played the narrator with perfect confidence. Sophia had helped design the costumes, her artistic touch visible in every detail. Isabella danced across the stage as a forest sprite, while Lucas, their shy tech genius, had surprised everyone by volunteering to sing a solo. As Alexander watched his children shine on stage, his phone vibrated silently in his pocket. He already knew what it said: the board's response to his proposal to permanently relocate Quantum Leap's headquarters to Phoenix. He'd presented his case last week. The growing tech scene, the tax benefits, the strategic positioning. What he hadn't mentioned was the way his heart raced every time he had to fly back to New York, afraid of missing another moment with his family. On stage, Lucas stepped forward for his solo. His small hands trembled slightly as he gripped the microphone, but his voice rang out clear and true. Alexander felt tears prick his eyes, remembering how Lucas had practiced in his living room, determined to overcome his fear of performing. Elena reached over and squeezed his hand, a gesture of support that had become natural over the past year. They weren't back together romantically, but they'd found something different, something just as valuable. a partnership built on raising their children and healing old wounds. After Lucas's performance, Isabella's dance number brought the house down. Alexander remembered teaching her to spin in his backyard, both of them getting dizzy and collapsing in fits of laughter. Sophia's costume designs drew gasps of appreciation. She'd insisted on adding magic sparkles to every outfit. And Maya, their serious firstborn, held the whole show together with her narration. During intermission, Alexander finally checked his phone. The board's response was unanimous. Approved. He could feel the weight lifting from his shoulders. No more cross-country flights, no more missed bedtime stories, no more seeing his children through a screen. Good news? Elena asked, noticing his expression. The best, he replied. I'm staying. Permanently. The company's moving here. Elena's eyes widened. Alexander, are you sure? New York has been your home for so long. New York has my company, he said softly. Phoenix has my heart. The second act began before Elena could respond. They watched as their children took their final bows, 4 bright stars shining on stage. Alexander remembered another night, 5 years ago, when he let fear drive him away from love. Now, looking at his family, he understood that true courage wasn't about being fearless, it was about being afraid and choosing love anyway. After the show, they gathered in the school hallway. Maya ran to him first, still wearing her narrator's crown. Did you see me, Daddy? Did you hear how I didn't forget any lines? You were amazing, sweetheart, he said, hugging her close. All of you were. Sophia showed him her costume sketches, Isabella demonstrated her dance moves one more time, and Lucas, still buzzing from his successful solo, talked non-stop about the lighting effects he'd helped program. Elena's parents joined them, her father clapping Alexander on the back. You did good, son, he said simply. Rosa appeared with armfuls of flowers for each child, winking at her sister. Later that night, after the children were tucked into bed, Maya in her space-themed room, Sophia surrounded by art supplies, Isabella's gymnastics medals glinting in the nightlight, and Lucas clutching his beloved tablet. Alexander and Elena sat in her kitchen, sharing a quiet cup of tea. Remember that day in the conference room? Elena asked. When you first saw them? How could I forget? I thought I was hallucinating. Alexander chuckled. I walked in expecting a business meeting and found my whole world turned upside down.